The State Museum closes, and that's just one part of the continuing budget impasse. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state government, sometimes the federal government, and how it just might affect your life. And boy, is it affecting things these days around the state of Illinois. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. With me today to talk about this, Bruce Rushton is back from Illinois Times, the feisty weekly in Springfield.
I'm getting feistier all the time.
Oh, there you go. Brian Mackey, reporter with Illinois Public Radio, also feisty, but in kind of calmer tones most of the time.
Yeah.
Welcome back, Brian.
Thanks.
Okay, speaking of feisty, the State Museum finally did close this week, as had been warned by the governor's administration that it might have to close at the end of September. And even though union employees under court order are continuing to get paid and showing up, but they have shuttered it, and some of the top leadership of the museum in Springfield has taken retirement or left their jobs, at least I think it's 5 or 6 people. And there's, as we tape the show, there's a plan for a candlelight vigil that's happening late in the week on Thursday night. What's the deal here?
Well, that's an excellent question. What is the deal? Because the employees who remain, the union employees at least, are still inside the building doing Lord knows what. There's no guests that are being allowed. If you go to knock on the door and want to buy a T-shirt, I suppose you're being turned away.
Yeah, they did. I did stop by on the last day it was open, which was Wednesday, and they basically, even that day, had closed the gift shop, and most of the shelves were clear. They were clearing things out.
Yeah. So presumably staff is your biggest expense in running that place. The staff is still there.
Yeah.
If you do the math on this, if it's strictly from a budget standpoint, why is that museum closed and the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum still open? Because that institution gets a larger amount of money from the state than the State Museum. So can this governor just not do math, or is there really something else going on here?
It's not unprecedented. You think, if it is really a money saving, I mean, there are other government entities that operate museums. You think of the Smithsonian in Washington, right? It's not unprecedented to have a government operate a museum to look at a state's history. The State Museum had natural history, Native American history,
Let's not put it all in the past. It still has it, because it may reopen at some point.
It may, but everything is such a mystery right now, and there's really not, the governor has said, we need to manage the budget. He blames the Democrats for not passing a balanced budget, kind of eliding the fact that his own budget presentation was pretty significantly out of the balance as well. But we don't really have a good justification of why this particular unit of state government, as opposed to the very many other billions of dollars that are spent in the state. Some of those are being court ordered to be spent now, so this is maybe an area where there's a little more flexibility than some other areas, but it's still, there has not, that I've seen, been put forth sort of a grand philosophical argument for why Illinois should not have a state museum.
Well, and you wonder how much of this damage, if it does in fact reopen, because I think there's maybe some line of thought out there saying, oh, well, it'll just be closed for a while, it'll be held hostage, so to speak, to this budget impasse, and then it'll open up. I'm not so sure it will be that easy, because again, we have 5, 6 folks who have retired. They've left, and that's both
including Bonnie Stiles, who has been the museum director.
Correct. That's both a great deal of institutional knowledge and scientific knowledge. There was a story out just the other day about how some researcher took his geological samples, packed them up in his U-Haul, and moved them up to Minnesota because they belonged to him. We've got to remember also, this museum is accredited. It's one of the few museums in the state of Illinois that actually is accredited. It holds accreditation, whereas again the ALPLM famously does not. And so what are the accrediting
ALPLM being the Presidential Library and Museum.
Yes. What are the accrediting bodies going to think of this? In other words, will this museum, if it should reopen, will it be able to regain and keep its accreditation?
I know it has to stay open to the public a certain number of days per year or over a period of time, and so there is, I know that was one of the opponents of closing it talked about that. I will say State Senator Andy Manar, who is from Bunker Hill in Macoupin County, but also represents the part of Springfield, including the museum. Of course, he's a Democrat. He said right now the workers are being paid. They are still showing up to work, and the layoffs Governor Rauner announced are on hold. Locking taxpayers out of a fully staffed facility doesn't save any money. It just seems mean-spirited and backwards. That's his view. And I will say Bill Brady, who is from Bloomington, state senator, who also represents part of Springfield. He represents the fairgrounds, but his territory does not get into the museum, but he's part of Springfield. He said he basically said, Governor Rauner's right. We need to get the turnaround agenda. We need to, get some changes in our economy to help things. Governor Rauner is doing this, and it's the Democrats' fault for passing a budget that's out of balance.
But again, it's interesting you should mention the fairgrounds. What are this governor's priorities? If it's really this bad, why did we have a fair this year? Because you can bring the fair back next year fairly easily. You can't so easily bring back a museum.
Well, we will see. I just noticed that I don't think there have been social service programs clearly that have been heard in the city of Chicago, where there's a much bigger population. But I can't imagine what would happen if state funding were stopped to a big museum downtown Chicago that actually was popular there as the State Museum, which I guess isn't an everyday thing to everyone, but certainly school groups and a lot of people make a lot of use of this museum. And it's being missed maybe more now than we have talked about it in years. But
we shouldn't overstay. I've been to the State Museum a number of times. It's often pretty empty, frankly. Sure. It's not the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum, which draws people internationally. It's certainly not the Field Museum in Chicago, which sees millions of people every year. But it is something significant for Springfield. They do a lot of educational events beyond, like you said, school groups go through. They have lectures. There's a big collections facility that they have in town.
Kids activities on many weekends.
Right. So it is a community staple. They just rededicated the building for former Senator, the late Alan Dixon, earlier this year. The governor spoke at that ceremony, and so. Sort of a hollow honor, I guess, if you're named for a building that's going to be shuttered a few months later.
A good point.
The plaque is still there. It's on the outside.
Yeah.
It's a good point. It is to some extent a, quote, ugly stepchild museum, but stepchildren are people too. And so, it's just really hard to understand. I think that Menard raises an excellent point. And I don't know what Brady's comeback and supporters would be. Why does it make sense to, have an empty building? And, what other things have been tried? For example, it could at least maybe offset it a little bit by charging admission. But as you point out, it's not a particularly well-attended facility. But do something.
Yeah, and I will say that just in reporting on this, as some of us have done, you find out that there are these government contracts that and scientific contracts that the museum has and carries out with its collection of 12 million items. And anytime Native American remains are found on a construction site, it's the State Museum people who work with that. So there are a lot of ongoing programs that are kind of beneath the surface that apparently are quite essential, but it's not the kind of thing that people know day to day.
That's true. And not to to push it a little bit further, I guess. The ripples from what's happening now are starting to spread and become more obvious in ways that I think people may not have thought about, at least early on. For example, there's word starting to come out that drug courts might be seeing some problems here because of the lack of funding for social service agencies and drug treatment programs, which drug courts rely on to remain in operation. If those things go by the wayside, then you've really taken a big hit, I think, from the criminal justice system, which actually defeats the purpose of saving money. Drug courts exist because they save money and they're a more progressive way of dealing with the drug problem, rather than just putting folks in prison at an average cost of $20,000 a year or what have you. So
I was just say that's a good point you make about things that are beginning to be more noticed now, right? Because one of the things is I think Governor Rauner has tried to have what you might almost call a stealth shutdown. His staff never uses that term, shut down the government, because they don't want this to be like a big Washington-style thing where you had a few years ago the World War II veterans, beating down the barricades so they could go to the museum when they were there on the memorial on the National Mall, because they were there on the honor flights and things like that. Those are very bad photo opportunities, and we know this governor is very sensitive to his public image. He had the big advertising campaign where he was half of it was attacking House Speaker Michael Madigan, half of it was bolstering his own appearance of being in control of things. So the more the public becomes aware of the problems that are happening throughout the state, I think it's going to start to be felt more. We have studiously avoided some of the things that could have happened, right? Schools could not have opened, but the governor signed that budget.
Yeah, just the education part of the budget.
Just the education,
legislature
right. That portion of the budget. Right. It could have been presumably that state police troopers could have been told to stay home without pay, and people would be lying in a ditch on the side of the road waiting for rescue or something like that.
But everybody went to court and got state employees paid.
State employees are being paid. The universities opened on time. And, full disclosure, my public radio station is affiliated with the University of Illinois in Springfield. So, there are a lot of aspects of state government that could have been shut down, but the governor really sought to avoid that. And so, it's sort of like what is left. You mentioned drug courts, social service agencies.
Right. Let me just, set the scene for anybody who just kind of joined us and hasn't been watching for a few months. The new fiscal year began July 1st. The legislature was supposed to pass a budget by the end of May. They did not. It went to the end of June, the end of the fiscal year, no agreement. The governor put out about $1 million worth of advertisements attacking Speaker Madigan and saying he wants to just make positive reforms in the state, which is his turnaround agenda, some of which erodes the power of unions, like letting local governments decide not to collectively bargain. And now we have a stalemate. We have no state budget, but court orders have paid state employees. So we have 90% or so of state money going out. However, the income tax dropped at the beginning of the year, so we're getting billions of dollars less into, so it's growing from what was a $3 or $4 billion hole in the budget to maybe a $8 billion by the end of the year, according to Leslie Munger, the comptroller, and on we go. A couple of the new things that have happened, police training courses have been canceled, and the Illinois Fraternal Order of Police, I know Brian put something out, and also university presidents are saying, hey, we're going on reserves now, but we have no budget and we can't do this forever. And a shadow of uncertainty is falling over many campuses in a letter that they sent to the governor.
The shadow of uncertainty, it's the next Marvel Avengers movie.
Well, I think you raise an excellent point, Brian, about this stealth shutdown thing. I mean, he doesn't want to do anything hugely dramatic, and yet the drama is building. And some of this stuff, I frankly wonder how much has to do with the budget at all. I'll give you one example. These are the papers of Abraham Lincoln Project. He has cut off all state funding for this project, and it wasn't very much funding. It was last year, it was like $240,000, and that leveraged, I think, $400,000 in federal money because you needed the federal grants. And not only has he cut off state funding, he has issued letters to University of Illinois Foundation, which is receives gifts to keep this project going, as well as the Abraham Lincoln Association, saying no employee of the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency can have any of this money. Don't give them a nickel. Well, it's not even state money. It's somebody else's money. And so what really is going, it's stuff like that. It's the scope. Again, this is a one small example. But the Papers Project doesn't consume $250,000. It's nothing. And then to say, not only are we not going to use any state money, but we're not going to use money from other places too. I think this budget impasse at times is being used for something else that we really can't figure out what it is.
Brian, what the Fraternal Order of Police came out pretty strongly, and I don't know, I guess it's a union, so maybe that...
It's a union. I mean, I think you said earlier that, the governor has this, what he calls a turnaround agenda, and that was 44 items, a bulleted list we got back in February, or was it January? I can't remember. It was the budget address or the State of the State address, very early on. That was whittled down to 5 items, really, by the time we got to summer and the budget impasse, and really the end of session. And that's changes to the workers' compensation system, changes to the tort lawsuit system, where people who are injured try to get compensation, term limits for legislators, changing the way districts are drawn. I'm skipping, my mind is forgetting the 5th one right now. But so
it could be property tax freeze.
Property tax freeze. Thank you. But a lot of these components have some element of them that unions find really objectionable.
Right. Like a property tax freeze has to include the ability of local governments not to pay prevailing wage and not to collectively bargain if they don't want to.
Exactly, which would affect teachers, lots of construction workers throughout the state, which are private union members. It's not just government union members. And then, those government union members feel under assault because of the contract negotiations that are happening right now between AFSCME, which represents tens of thousands of state workers, including some of the museum employees we've been talking about.
Of the old contract that ran out at the end of the fiscal year.
Right, and they the sides seem very far apart there. And so you have the Fraternal Order of Police in that context, right? These and you mentioned, the governor has these ideas that the House has taken up 14, 15 times the property tax freeze, but it doesn't include
the anti-union
stuff the governor wants. And
so the governor says they won't
take up my bill, right? And so, I mean, it's more than just kind of like a little thing. It's kind of the whole thing, I think, that's really the sticking point happening right here. The Fraternal Order of Police put out this very strongly worded statement where they said law enforcement officers know about hostage situations where people try to get their way by threatening innocent lives. And they go on to say that the governor is basically holding the state hostage.
Right. Is that really fair? Because the governor will say, his people continue to say, you can't just keep throwing money at the problem. We're not going to, raise more revenue unless we make fundamental change, and fundamental change means those things in the turnaround agenda we just talked about.
Well, I've got a simple solution to this.
And the Democrats, of course, say that goes against our core beliefs. That will never happen. And Scott Walker in Wisconsin.
Unions is not just about weakening unions. Unions are a key funding and get out the vote support for the Democratic Party. Yeah. Exactly. So you're really going after the heart of the Democrats' future viability, and you're saying, okay, well, I'll help you pass. I will let you vote for a tax increase, which no politician wants to do, or very few politicians want to do anyway. In exchange, if you help me really weaken the main, one of the main sources of your fundraising and future political viability.
Let me raise a point. Scott Walker, who is one of the governor of Wisconsin, who Governor Rauner has talked about as having made positive change in his state in the past, Scott Walker actually grew in national view, and of course the presidential thing hasn't worked out, but partly because union people came to the Capitol and in Madison, Wisconsin, and were, camped out and chanted and did all this stuff. And Governor Rauner, it seems, certain things are starting to get to a point where that might happen. Might he want that in some way to make it look like, I'm fighting the good fight just like Scott Walker did?
I don't know if that's going to happen. Again, look, there's a simple solution to this. What you do is they owe CWLP how much money the state for unpaid electric bills, cut off their power. Yeah. And preferably
I don't think Mayor Langfelder in Springfield is going to do that.
Well, but if you did it, preferably if you could catch it at a time when Rauner, Cullerton, and Madigan are in an elevator together. But yeah, that kind of a dramatic thing actually might work. Not camping out, but cut off their freaking power. They'd cut off my power. So
yeah.
Well, you mentioned that because that's Secretary of State Jesse White put out a statement, I think at the end of last week or the beginning of this week, where he said not going to be able to, or it was last week he wrote a letter to the governor saying, I'm worried about the power at the Capitol.
And at all the Secretary of State facilities and garbage pickup there. But also, some people have said, until your driver's the regular person in Illinois, in other words, the person who is not on a particular kind of Medicaid or whatever, and I'm not saying you're not regular if you're on Medicaid, I'm sorry. I'm just saying to a lot of people who are not directly affected by state government, it's the fact that Jesse White now says, I am not going to send out by mail reminders to get a renewal sticker for your license plate, and I will save whatever it is, $5 million a year by doing that. That is one of the new things that just happened because they have to save that mail money to send out the actual license plate.
Well, that actually makes sense to me. That's $450,000 a month. And frankly, maybe I'm unique here. I never pay any attention to that because it comes out 3 months earlier. I just have it in my own head when my license tabs expire.
You are unique in that.
I don't have a fleet of automobiles unlike you. But
well, can I say, I am exactly the opposite, and this really hit home with me. One, I was shocked that it costs $450,000 to send out postcards, though. They're tiny little, it's not like the big envelopes you used to get. It's a tiny little postcard.
There's 11 million cars or something in Illinois.
Apparently, yeah. So I just, a week or two ago, got my little postcard, and that's what I need to remind me. I'm not looking at the sticker on the back of my car, and I'm wondering, I bet you're going to start to see some significant number of people who don't know when their expiration is, or maybe they have
which generates
a couple
revenue,
of different
which
cars.
Keeps the museum open.
Sure. We will see. But people are going to start getting tickets, and maybe they're going to start paying attention to the state government a little more.
As various programs are seeing funding cut, ConAgra is an agricultural company, and it is moving headquarters from Naperville to Chicago. Brian, does that create kind of any just interesting conversation? Because apparently the governor has offered them some sort of tax credit. I'm not sure if the details have come out.
ConAgra is a Nebraska, I believe, based company. They make, is it Slim Jim and Hebrew National hot dogs,
those are
things
two of
like
their
that.
brands.
Yeah, and so they are leaving, despite what we've heard about businesses leaving Illinois, they've actually decided to relocate to Illinois. They're doing a big layoff.
Although they have like 350 people in Naperville.
They're bringing them to Chicago, but they're bringing a lot of people from Nebraska, or at least telling them move or find another job, I
Welcome
guess.
Slim Jims.
Yeah, exactly. So this is coming to Chicago. They are getting, apparently we've seen from Tribune's reporting, some EDGE tax credits. This is where you get to keep your employee share of the income tax, and you can use that if you reinvest in hiring and that sort of thing. The governor has been critical of these. State Senator Andy Menard, who we talked about earlier, has been critical of these. A lot of people have been critical of these tax credits. But what's interesting to me is that, one, these are going out. The governor had suspended this program, but apparently these were negotiated before that suspension was put in place.
There have been a couple of incidents where businesses are getting credits because they were talked about before the alleged freeze and this impasse happened.
And so then, again, it raises the question that Bruce pointed out earlier about priorities, right? As you have social service agencies, child care agencies, people who care for autism programs, programs for the developmentally disabled. As these programs are getting hurt and getting cut, ConAgra is going to get a tax break to move to Illinois. And yet, another interesting wrinkle, when Governor Pat Quinn would issue these, previously you'd have countless press releases, ribbon cuttings, public events. He would thump his chest. Hardly a word from the governor's office on all these sort of things.
Well, the governor hasn't been that public lately anyway.
No, he hasn't.
So.
And again, I mean, frankly, I think it's kind of weak sauce. So you'd say, well, this pre-existed the freeze that went in place. The social compact that the state has made with its citizenry to provide the sorts of citizen services which it has traditionally provided predates ConAgra by quite, by a large margin. Now you can debate whether these are appropriate compacts or not, but they nonetheless exist. And so you're going to pull the plug on these folks and give zillions of dollars to ConAgra.
Well,
we don't know how many zillions we're talking about. Yeah.
Well, one other thing I would just add to that point that that you talk about the social compact, and I think it's easy for there to be a disconnect when we have these disparate network of groups that provide care for people with mental illness and substance abuse. Those used to be core state functions, and we've outsourced those over the past few decades in Illinois. And now there are these private agencies. They're relatively weak. I mean, it would be if that
they're
was
weak
still
without state money. Yeah,
right. Well,
they've got 20
they also
employees.
don't have the lobbying power of ConAgra or Commonwealth Edison or anyone like that. I mean, they can come hold a press conference or can get people to wear the same color T-shirt and show up in the rotunda of the Capitol, but they're not handing out millions of dollars in political contributions to both Democrats and Republicans, as a lot of the most powerful companies in the state do. And so you have this relatively weak, relatively silent population that it used to be they were cared for directly by the state, because we as a state decided we're not going to leave these people to die in the street or languish in their basements or whatever. And now we've outsourced that, and we're kind of quietly hoping they die off or something. I'm not sure what exactly the plan is.
Maybe you can. How many times did Rauner use the word compassion and compassionate?
It actually came out at the inauguration.
Correct.
that he said, I want to be competitive and compassionate.
It was even at his acceptance speech.
Acceptance speech.
I remember that.
After
the crowd was enthusiastic.
I like being one-upped.
It struck me because he said, we're going to be the most competitive state. Yay! The crowd cheers and the most compassionate state. And the crowd was sort of,
well, he hadn't mentioned it much during the campaign, right?
Well, compassion comes before ConAgra in the dictionary.
Okay. I think there's a lot of interest in agriculture in central and western Illinois and other places that this show might be seen, but Phil Nelson, the director of Ag, resigned, but apparently was asked to resign. We know this because Patrick Buchan, who was the manager of the state fair, resigned in protest and said, I'm leaving too, because they made Phil resign for no reason, and we thought we could have some control over the fair, and I'm not sure, they were mad about what they said was cronyism or something being influenced at the fair, but then the governor's office shot back and said, well, Buchan had erratic behavior, and they released an email of his, basically saying, leave me alone, to one of the governor's staffers. And so where does this leave us?
Well,
what do we think of this?
I think it's more than as much as anything. It's a look at how Rauner plays ball when someone tries questioning him. He plays hardball. I mean, he releases this email that Mr. Buchan had said, if you bloody my nose, I'll bloody yours, or sort of words
right.
stuff. It really
to one of the deputy governors.
To Alec Messina, who was the environmental policy advisor. How he gets involved in some spat over who's going to be
I think he might have had a hand in determining who was going to be the Grand Marshal
who was a submarine commander. I mean,
right.
So
USS Illinois.
USS Illinois.
Which actually was a little odd, I thought, for Director Buchan to want to put the agricultural company people from Springfield at the head of that line over the military people, and the governor's office, I think, has the right to make that decision, don't they?
Well, yes and no, I guess. I mean, I don't know how
Maybe
how
Mr.
all this
Buchan
exactly
thought he
works.
had total control.
Well, Buchan did not go gently into that good night.
He did not. He talked to a lot of media
talked
outlets,
to a lot of
including
folks.
us.
He was open, and I found that to be refreshing, frankly. And so we knew exactly what his beef was. And the governor's office didn't back down. And so they're trying to release these emails, and a lot of folks were, well, this is Mr. Loose Cannon. I said, you know, to myself at least, no, this is a guy that seemed to think that he was handed some authority and thought that he had the ability to use it, and then got the rug pulled out from underneath him. Right. And so, you know, who's running the state fair? Is it me, or is it some guy, as he put it, downtown? And so, you know, we don't see that sort of openness or candor or you know,
a lot of people
rock
do
fights.
go quietly into that good night.
They do. They stab you in the back in the middle of the night, and that's not what happened this time. And so Rauner, I guess, to not to belabor the point, but Rauner has been very reticent in terms of releasing any kinds of emails.
Well, and let me get into that because we only have a couple minutes
Sure.
left, but I just want to mention that you, Bruce, your picture was in my column because
That's what
and speaking of lawsuits, there is one, and we can discuss that, but you, I guess, had done some initial reporting. I was out of town at the time when the Holocaust Memorial happened back in April, and the governor appeared there, and I think he spoke, and then left.
He spoke briefly and left before the
Before the 87-year-old survivor of the Holocaust spoke. So the governor and his entourage, or I don't know who was with him, left. You tried to find out why. They wouldn't tell you. You have now sued on behalf of yourself and your newspaper to get governor schedules. They say they won't release them. In asking questions actually about something else, but this also, the governor's office did tell me through a statement that he went to meet with the leaders, which nobody knew he had done that day back in April. And now we learned that the governor and the 4 leaders of the legislature as a group haven't met since May, which is months as we've had this budget impasse. Your thoughts on where that goes and why that's important?
Well, the reason why it's important is exactly because we do have a right in this state and in this nation to know what public officials are doing on public time with public money. That's what this really boils down to. And so Rauner could have avoided this whole thing if his staff simply would have told me where he'd gone. I would never have filed a FOIA request. You know, this was this important to me. You know, when it first started, now it's kind of this important to me. And the reason why it's important is that the governor should not be allowed to operate in secrecy and set the rules and make up the rules as he goes along. He was late, for example, in responding to my FOIA request, and his explanation was, well, because the records you asked for weren't public records. Excuse me? That's not for you to decide. So, at any rate, the governor would be smart at this point in time to simply, I mean, it's nice that he told you. I haven't heard squat from him. So, it would be nice if he would give me the documents that I requested, and we can make this litigation as short and simple as easy.
Well, I'm sure all his people in Springfield will be watching this show. Brian, your thoughts on, should they have a meeting? Is that a big deal?
Well, I do, you know, I guess the people involved have said that the last few meetings have not been very productive because it basically consists of the governor sort of reiterating his agenda as he's done in public.
And not moving off the
last
vestiges of the turnaround.
Yeah.
With that, we have to end it. Bruce Rushton, Brian Mackey, thanks for the conversation. Thank you for watching. I'm Bernie Schoenburg, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.